right, so now that we've talked about food and eating, we're going to shift gears and talk about achievement. So this is probably more relevant for areas like employment or work or something like educational or school achievement. So before we get into it, let me just make sure that everybody is aware that there's actually an entire subfield of psychology that's very relevant to this, and it's called IO psychology, which stands for industrial and organizational psychology. So those are psychologists that work with organizations and places of employment to help improve motivation and therefore performance of their employees. It's a highly lucrative subfield of psychology. Essentially, you're an independent consultant for different organizations, and you can make a lot of money that way. So if this is an area that interests you, or you find this kind of material interesting, potentially consider getting a PhD in something like IO psychology. There are schools that offer PhDs in that particular area. So, I think this particular subsection of your textbook will be very relevant for you regardless of the career you choose, regardless of the major you pick, because it's essentially talking about how to set yourself up for success in terms of achieving goals. So there's pretty robust research out there that tells us how to write what I call smarter goals, so goals that you're more likely to achieve. So the first is the goal has to be specific. Too often, we set ourselves up for failure by just saying something really, really vague. So, for example, a lot of people for their New Year's resolutions will say, I want to lose weight. Okay, what does that mean? How much weight? And for most of us, it isn't really the weight we're so much worried about. It might be how we feel. Do we feel sluggish? Can we wear particular clothing? So to say I'm going to lose weight is just really, really vague. We also want to make sure that the goal is challenging but achievable. So first of all, we want to make sure it's something that does kind of push us a little bit. It has to be something that we feel like we have to work towards and put a little bit of energy or effort into. But if it's an unachievable goal, you will not work towards it. You won't even get started. A lot of people think, well, I'll just set my goal super high and I'll just work towards it, and in doing that, I'll achieve something. But in actuality, if it's too steep of a hill to climb, you're not going to even get started. So for example, for me to set the goal that I'm going to run a marathon, okay, there's no way. I will never be able to run a marathon. I can tell you my body craps out around 6 miles. I don't know why. That is the furthest I've ever run. And so for me to set a goal to get in better shape and say that I'm going to set my goal as run a marathon, I know it's not achievable, and I probably won't even run a single step in trying to achieve a goal. The other thing is that we want to frame it as more of an approach goal rather than an avoidance goal. So that's why many people, by saying they want to lose weight, are setting themselves up for failure. You're better off framing it as something you want to do rather than something you're trying to stop doing or something you're losing. So for example, anytime I try to set a goal to get in better shape, I always frame it in terms of what I am going to do, which might be something like I'm going to run 30 minutes 3 times a week, or I'm going to be active 30 minutes every single day. So I'm framing it as what I'm going to do. It's very specific. And yeah, it might be a little bit hard for me to fit that in my schedule, but it's achievable both in terms of timing and what I'm physically capable of. So in kind of addition to these characteristics of goals, we also have to think about different types of goals. And so this is another way we can explain why some people have a hard time sticking with goals or maybe don't respond well to criticism. So performance goals, that's where the person basically is solely motivated by not being criticized or by wanting to get positive feedback. And so this is basically they just want to perform well enough to not, embarrass themselves or again to get criticized. Mastery or learning goals, the goal is to learn. So that's why I kind of put this in parentheses here to kind of highlight that the person is finding intrinsic pure pleasure in learning. The learning is the fun part, right? It's a process rather than being motivated by the outcome. And so this is an individual who's working to increase competency, increase skill. They're more likely to stick with it when they fail because they see the failure as part of the learning process. Whereas somebody who's, again, solely motivated by performance is going to see just the failure, and the failure is problematic, because that is the outcome that they're trying to avoid. And so we see students that are motivated by mastery as more likely to stick it out when maybe they struggle. They're more likely to see a bad grade or negative feedback from an instructor as, again, part of the process. And so the goal the person has going into a particular activity can actually help you predict how likely they are to stick with it. And so an IO psychologist that comes in to help an organization or a company is going to be looking at a lot of different aspects of the job and a lot of different aspects of the company to try to predict how much effort the employee will put in, or how satisfied they'll rate that they are. And so there's actually a lot of really surprising things that go into job satisfaction or will predict job performance. Work actually has to be meaningful and important to employees for them to want to do well. And so that's really important to think about, because more menial tasks on jobs might not feel very meaningful or important to the person. I think back to my first job I was a file clerk for a doctor's office. And so this was back when they actually had paper charts and a lot of documents that needed to be filed, like lab reports and summaries of appointments and things like that. That job did not feel super meaningful or important to me at first, because it was just throwing papers in folders. I was in this back cramped file closet, and I had to stand on this really awkward ladder, and it was poorly lit. It just didn't feel very meaningful to me. But then they actually started to let me help a little bit with more patient interactions, and it became more meaningful, because then when I was holding Mrs. Smith's chart and I wanted to make sure her lab work got in there, it just felt so much more important to me than when, again, I was just kind of stuck back in the file closet, not really attaching any importance to what I was doing. Another really important aspect of work is that employees have to feel they have some control over what they're doing. And even if it's just, letting the employee decide whether they would start at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. each day, just that amount of control actually dramatically improves job performance, motivation, and satisfaction. It's better if tasks are varied rather than extremely repetitive tasks. Sometimes that can be hard, because depending on the job description, maybe it is just a repetitive job where a person is in charge of putting one bolt on a car as the car goes by them, on a assembly line. But the more varied it can be, the more satisfied they're going to report being. Relationships with coworkers are extremely important. I don't think that surprises anybody. But also relationships with their superiors. If employees get useful, emphasis on useful feedback, can't just be criticism that feels like it's just kind of breaking down the employee's morale. It has to be feedback that the person feels like they can use to then improve their performance. Another one that companies often forget about is employees want opportunities to learn and advance. If employees feel like there's no opportunity for promotion or learning different skills, or doing something slightly different in the future, maybe even with the same company, the same department in the company, they just want to feel like they're maybe working towards something a little bit, seen as a little bit more advanced or a little bit better, whatever that means for them. Those are the people that are going to report more job satisfaction. And so companies that do these things, that incorporate this into life for their employees, are going to have happier employees, more motivated employees, and really it benefits the company in the end. If you have a better performing employee, it helps you. And so I like this little figure here, because I think it kind of pulls together a lot of the things we've talked about. So the working conditions, do the employees have opportunity for advancement? Do they have some control over what's happening? Do they like who they work with and who they work for? But also aspects of them, right? Are they intrinsically motivated to do well, right? What are they working for each day? Are they just working to avoid getting in trouble, or are they working to master a skill? These all lead to what the employee is going to perceive as their goals, right? Again, are they trying to just avoid getting in trouble, or are they trying to actually master something? This then leads to the person's own expectations of what they want to do each day on the job, and their confidence in doing so, which ultimately leads to their level of intrinsic motivation. So remember at the beginning of this lecture, I kind of spoiled the end or the whole point of what I was kind of building to. Intrinsic motivation is the key ingredient to an individual who's more likely to stick through failure, again, take criticism and turn it into performing better. They're more likely to actually achieve the thing they're trying to achieve if they're intrinsically motivated. And these are kind of the steps or the components that build to intrinsic motivation. So that brings me to the end of chapter 10, which is on motivation. Again, there's some stuff in your textbook I didn't assign on love and sex. Feel free to read it. I just had to narrow it down to make sure we could accomplish a certain amount of material this week. All right, the next video will be on chapter 11, which is on emotion, stress, and health.